This is Duke University.
Thank you, Amanda, for putting together all this wonderful event, and thanks for having me. It's been really good. It's been a really good day listening to very, very different kind of perspectives, but actually probably resonate on various levels. And I do realize that it's quite late in the day. At least you have something to eat while you listen to me. It's going to be a bit of a grey talk. It's going to be mostly about networks that relate to the internet. So actually networks in that sense. I've been working on topics, various topics, but recently I've been interested in times, temporalities. I'm a kind of a historian, like a proper historian. I was supposed to be a proper historian originally, but I've been interested in different kinds of temporalities. More recently, extremely slow, long durations that relate to discussions having to do with Anthropocene and, let's say, geological durations, and in a way playing with the idea of how do you write media history from the point of view of geology, i.e. minerals and metals and so forth. Okay? So, and then the other pole being microtemporalities, stuff that escapes, perhaps, experience, human experience and human perception, but still somehow structures the way in which networks also structure our social life. So in a way, my talk is going to be actually about, it's a media archaeological take on a kind of a small topic, but that can be read in a big way as well, having to do with how some minor topics in networks introduce notions of temporality that are quite important when you start thinking about those things as social events, right? So reading issues of network engineering by definition as social events, and hence political as well, okay? So these are kind of key things that I'm going to be addressing. But I'll start with something, and my key ideas is also related to media theory, talking as a media theorist, is that instead of the usual way in which we talk about the time of the internet and internet or cyberspace times as one of flows or even disappearance of time, actually I would claim that no, it's not about disappearance of time, it's multiplicity and multiplication of various temporalities, even if we don't always perceive them immediately, okay? Well, I'll start with just a kind of a prelude to the whole talk, and Turkish media artist Ali Miharbi's piece, actually I should have checked how you pronounce it, Geniş Zaman, which is not that technically complex piece that I luckily saw just recently in Istanbul. But it immediately intrigues for some other reasons. It's a beautifully clean design object of clocks that brings to mind this kind of classical way of representing world times by simultaneous clocks showing how, for instance, New York pairs up with Moscow, how nighttime Sydney is synchronized with daytime Paris and London. As for Miharbi's piece, he visited several places in and around Istanbul to mark the times. From Taksim to Haydarpaşa old train station, from his personal wristwatch to a range of usually public clocks that were mostly on time. Some of them had stopped ages ago, like the train station time after a fire at the place. Others were kept in rather good and accurate time, but with those minor slight differences. Miharbi explains that the title translates as simple present, but literally it means broad or wide time. For Miharbi, the piece is about measurement. And actually the multiplicity of measurements of time that I would add are also creative of times. Not just a second order reflection, but an active production of time through cultural techniques. But as part of the assumed measurement of time, this points also to another important technique of time, for instance, synchronization, essential for timekeeping on global planetary levels as much as on the microtemporal levels of computers and networks. So the key point being that I want to approach network ecologies as ecologies of time. In a way, this relates to what we just heard earlier in your presentation about the Nintendo presentation. Synchronization, temporalities, etc. But the fact that the clocks in Miharbi's piece were analog, mechanical, in some ways still having to be adjusted and measured manually in relation to global time is itself a significant input to Mihaly's idea. Time is always a matter of synchronization and other cultural techniques of time keeping and time maintaining, which are going to be part of dead media themselves, obsolete media pasts, because of the gradual emergence of automated satellite-based digital updating systems. So, in the future, we might not have temporal errors of this sort, but a promise of universal time that also removes the idea of time modification from human hands on human errors and places it part of an automated system with specific protocols and social and software algorithms. This is a rather straightforward way of starting with an art example, but it raises the key questions I'm interested in. The fact that there are specific cultural techniques that pertain to time synchronization, maintenance, and keeping time, that time doesn't just flow or exist. Time exists only if it's carefully managed. You have to care for time. That there are media of time, from church bells to Greenwich times, which somehow offer a horizon of temporality. But also that the question of network ecologies is one not only of spatial sense, but a time of ecology. The political economy of quantified units is, according to classic Marxist critiques, for instance, since Lukács, one of loss of time, that we have lost time because time becomes quantified into units, as we see also managed as questions of slowness and speed, of synchrony and waiting. All these things that we recognize from social beings of humans, but also pertain to the way in which networks structure the social, right? Hence, my talk is a short dip into this specific way of looking at this issue of networks through its times, how to understand network through time and temporalities, and what we can call a media archaeological look into early network plans, ideas and engineering, how to manage network publics as one question of not only real-time interaction, but the deep and non-human levels on which bursts turn into flows. The reason I'm mentioning bursts and flows relates to past decades of network discussions. On the one hand, the recurring topic of referring to network time, internet time, and events as flows. And the other hand, even the critical theory trend of contributing to this idea of lack of time, that we have lost time. The way in which critical theorists, such as already mentioned Paul Virilio, lamented the loss of temporality in network cultures is one good example. Another person who was mentioned today and yesterday, Siegfried Zielinski's talk about monotemporalities, suddenly as if we're living in an age of homogeneous temporalities of internet times. Manuel Castells' way of defining network culture temporality as timeless time. And critics like Franco Pifo Berardi, who we talked about today as well, have pointed towards the incommensurable relation between human times and the accelerated machine times of information culture, in a way expresses a bit too narrow understanding of temporality in network culture, despite the other benefits it introduces. Of course, not everybody has lost a grip on the multiplicity of times. I'm going to quote Robert Hassan, who writes, "What kind of time do we experience online when we get lost amid dead links, get blocked at restricted access sites, search queries that lead to who knows where? It's not clock time and it's not swatch time. It's a time of lags and latencies, of waiting and clicking through, of fast and slow. It is the experience of differing speeds and asynchronicity." But it's not limited only to human experience, is the key point. It's not only that we experience these times of lags and delays, and that constitutes our network ecologies of the internet time. In addition to a level of experience, we can also track of non-experience level of networks in terms of speeds and lags and ethological relations of speeds and slownesses. It is actually something we can track down to a level of micro-temporality as well. Okay? Micro-temporality being a key concept here. The clock time of labor that characterizes human labor in factories, divided into quantified units, doesn't disappear in network culture, but the clocks become internalized in machines, obviously, concretely in computer clock times and network temporalities of pings. We need to engage with the arguments of the cultural critics, feeling sorry for the implosion of space and time in cyberspace. Time has not disappeared at all. There are lots of it. And it's very quick, and it's managed in milliseconds and quicker, as short bursts and time-critical process of networks, exactly like we heard earlier in relation to financial networks as well. Temporalities which produces senses of the public, of experience, as well as themselves embody the social as packets, as in packet switching, for instance, that negotiate who goes first, who has to wait. Partly these kind of times of lags and delays become emphasized as a topic of network politics. For instance, quite concretely in the past years of net neutrality debates. However, instead of the now, at beginning with this kind of notion of microtemporality, I'm going to actually end with it. I'm going to be at the end talking about the notion of microtemporality and time criticality as introduced by German media theorist Wolfgang Ernst. I've leave that to the end and first engage with this kind of this small, very tiny case study having to do with temporality in network ecology and network engineering. And briefly talking about how early network planning engaged with the topics of public and service through time, the inherent temporalities that were part and parcel of the plan, not the disappearance of time, but a multiplication of time. And meticulous interest in production of temporalities and time techniques, but on a computational level, on level of computational processes and network transmission. Indeed, time didn't disappear, but it becomes a matter of microtemporal modulation through packets, routes, and address spaces that themselves constitute an infrastructure for the future data public. So hence, the key theme now, network times and the public. So, okay, in terms of, media history and history of internet and network ecologies, we have a number of internet histories, as well as accounts that tell the stories of networks, and as such, their ecologies, variations, technologies, and uses. Even if these historical accounts are plenty and very good, we have enough attention, we need more attention to the great temporal aspects of this side of technical media culture of networks. Again, it's not that time has been completely absent from discussions of networks and politics, but it's mostly being geared towards the notion of real time, right? Real-time information systems ever since 1960s, the debates ever since 1960s, included the social situations of negotiating temporal ordering of signals, as well as switches between peripheral devices and the environment, including users, via, for instance, interrupt. Hence, such an engineering of information systems and network traffic can also be seen as an engineering of the social, which itself connects to the way in which time was managed through the units of information traffic. And it's not an accident why I'm emphasizing these certain notions that seem to be referring to urban life. The notion of the public was articulated and redefined in relation to information architectures. Indeed, an architectural shift was starting to take place gradually since the 1960s, 1970s, relating to old media like the telephones and new media relating to data. Public switched telephone networks were still used for data connections, even if increasingly debated as to their suitability. In terms of public data networks, purpose-built for the new real-time communication systems, other sorts of issues were also addressed, including that of time. So basically, these kind of social events that anyone familiar, anyone lives in, urban situations, has lived in urban situations like queuing and congestion, they also became important for network design and management as well. These kind of themes occupied the early packet switching discourse, which was determined to find out and find the best practices for temporary storage of messages. So these kind of basic situations that, sociologists of early days occupied themselves with, urban dilemmas having to do with congestion and social codes having to do with, queuing up, for instance, and the frustration having to do with that, or the social codes having to do with queuing. They also turned into questions of network standards or network procedures. and standards of even increasing importance, as it was through standardization that the connection of several private or isolated computers and technologies had to take place, right? In other words, the notion of real time did not, of course, pertain to humans, not only at least, and it was more of a pragmatic question of real enough time. Instead of real time, what is real enough time to be perceived as real time, right? What we perceive as smooth enough response time, but what computer systems definitely will perceive as delay or lag. This puts the emphasis on even quicker temporal events and shorter durations. If we look at time from not the perspective of humans, okay, how we perceive and experience time, but from the perspective of how would the computer experience time as well. Real time, so basically I'm quoting here from an early 1970s text. Real-time systems where there is a strict upper limit on the time within which the computer must deal with the signals from a number of input channels. Quasi-real-time systems where the failure of the computer's response causes annoyance rather than damage, and batch processing systems where the response is not at all critical and jobs may be scheduled to use the resources of the computer to best advantage. This comes from some of the work in the National Physical Laboratory in the UK in Teddington by Donald Davies, one of the early pioneers in packet switching and computer science of networking. These were the issues concerning time as part of the new epistemology of data networks, right? So this was not only a part of planning or specific technical systems having to do with new national data publics, right? It had to do with the new epistemology, a new way of thinking about the public, the nation, and also data in relation to networks, right? And the question of time was at the center of the whole thing. So in this is like a prelude to the internet age and our internet age debates having to do with networks, right? Hence media archaeology. For them, these people engaging with these questions in the 60s, 70s, telephone networks didn't represent only old technology that was now to be purposed for new ends. Telephone networks were also an epistemology, a way of thinking, a way of acting, a framework for thinking about data, framework for thinking about networks. Compared to the networks and techniques of telephoning. Basically, when you telephone, you still had the call and its length as the unit of traffic, bearing a more direct relation to the social events and habits that were enabled by circuit switch-based network technologies. So basically, your talkative mood measured as part of network traffic quite directly. The longer the receiver was lifted, the longer the circuit was activated. More words, more things to say and share, longer calls, more traffic. With data, things change a bit, especially when data becomes measured and transported in different ways. This kind of a temporality is not anymore measured only by how long you chat on the line, so to speak, but the microsecond intervals of samples taken from the analog waveform of sound at the rate of 8,000 of those per second. This indeed is one context of microtemporality that opens up primarily to the machine time, not only to the lived time of human beings. It complexifies the notion of the experienced network time and points towards the other network temporalities that would need to account for, as also not through human experience only, but other modes of measuring, right? It's not that the public analog telephone networks were suddenly abandoned, of course. We know that even from the 80s and 90s, for instance, the amount of time spent tinkering with modems, that themselves were supposed to be translating not only digital to analog signals, but also open up the new public sphere of BBSs, bulletin board systems. It is interesting to look at the intermediary forms in which the switch was negotiated and managed through modem technologies. For instance, focus paid to different switch-based networks by Davies and Barber in this fantastic, and quite geeky computer engineering book, Communication Networks for Computers from early 1970s. Indeed, it becomes clear, and it's funny, the method being that what if you take these texts from computer science and computer engineering and read them not only as about computers and networks, but read them as social theory, read them as sociological texts, right? As a speculative experience. What if that is the new sociology of the network era? It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but that's a kind of method to think about that. So it becomes clear that one of the focuses was on the negotiation of private and public in terms of switching, creating private lines in public networks, network topologies and private circuits. The existence of private data networks had already to do with a range of microtemporal events, techniques of non-human networking, such as rapid polling of terminals in businesses such as banks and airline systems. These institutions represented the overlapping areas of globalizing finance capital and information networks as support for computer-based banking and global travel. Again, kind of archaeology of what we now engage with in relation to networks, finance, global capitalism, right? In other words, we need to be meticulous when considering network archaeologies as an aid to current discussions about the public and private spheres of neoliberal capitalism and its practices, as well as try to look in more detail how such ideas of the public were negotiated across a messy field of arrangements and management of time. And packet switching, as one specific technique, of course, was early on one such. So the work on packet switching networks began the first half of 1960s. For instance, in the US with Paul Baran's important writing coming out in 1964, and in the UK at the National Physical Laboratory, design plans for public data networks a bit later, around 1966. The specific cultural technique of networking remained for a long time much debated, which packets, debates about sharing, about publicness and the common infrastructure were at the core of the whole issue again. So basically again, this kind of introduction of new technological solutions like packet switching were also debates about what is the social in terms of network traffic as well, and how do you negotiate that, right? So these guys act as like sociologists. Instead of Durkheim and Gabriel Tard, we got 60s and 70s network engineers. Not recognized as sociologists, of course, and not similar methods, but in tongue-in-cheek, they are doing social theory. So, of course, the whole idea of common infrastructures for communication was underlying some of the thinking behind earlier projects too, just for economic reasons of sharing telegraph and telephone lines with the help of multiplexing gradually through packets. But what was interesting was the question of the common or shared as a question of time, right? As asynchronous and multiple communication needed ways to actually synchronize and manage what we could call a symphony of packets, right? As a kind of an access to the common, to be able to share and be having a common space or public space even of sorts. Also, packet-based networking responded to this design question of deciding who speaks when, temporal management. Packet switching networks demonstrated one way of responding to the situation of asynchronous and multi-temporal connections. In the age of packets, these decisions become less hierarchies of human social rank than what speaks when. The problems of delay, waiting, queuing become integrated as network and software events. These kind of time-critical events and temporalities like storage become functionalized as part of traffic flow. Sorting, routing, and managing packets between computers becomes a necessity of increasing importance, as well as where to store temporarily a packet on queue. In time-shared systems, on an individual computer, but now in networks in more distributed form, storage becomes integrated as part of transmission. Like it was already with, for instance, the telegraph system. Message stored in paper tapes at relay stations, with humans doing much of the work of storing and rerouting. Kind of an archaeology of packet switching. With packet switching, the nodes had to be equipped with suitable computer memory to do the work of, what used to be humans at the manual message switching stations. From the point of view of an archaeology of networks and politics of publicness, this is a fascinating step. Basically, microtemporality becomes a way to conceptually observe this relationship of data and humans. Even issues of network politics show their relations with time and management of time, to care for time. The work of networks becomes more than networking and communicating, and so much emphasis is here focused on exactly the medium. What stands between and what enables the communicative event, this fantasy of non-interrupted flow and real-time connection. There is no flow unless it is managed and synchronized as flow, right? There is no real time unless it is managed to be at real enough time. Even the words of these pioneers like Davies and Barber, this could be interpreted as a post-human scenario of sorts, to refer to post-human media theory in a kind of, again, tongue-in-cheek way, geared towards making human publics happen through the information events of computers and networks. And I'll quote from this peculiar text from 1972 again. Basically, according to Davies and Barber, whereas message switching systems are intended to meet the needs of human users, the packet switching network is designed primarily for computer-to-computer communications. It has a much more rapid response which matches the internal behavior of computers and handles more information in much the same way as does a computer. At the same time, it can readily match the speed of attached computers to that of terminal of users by virtue of its internal storage, where it can delay. It's all about delaying so that we humans can adjust, to put it a bit simplistically. In a way, speaking about non-human in media studies context and media theory context is not that new. It's one of those big topics that we are fascinated about. But speaking about the non-human element is not even a cultural theoretical exaggeration of someone mesmerized by recent years of academic debates. What if we start looking at post-human media theory through these kind of contexts? Indeed, if we look at the descriptions and the diagrams and plans in these kind of earlier computer science and engineering texts, we find a constant emphasis on how to negotiate this difference that is primarily temporal. And of course, in relation to interface theory and these famous images from Licklider's texts, it's all there as well. Of how do you negotiate interactive communication between different speeds? Here, the possibility of computer overflooding ourselves because of our slowness. Mediation takes place I'm not going to go into this. Mediation takes place inside machines as much as between people. Media happens already inside computers, of course. Different but network computers have to learn to manage information signals in concert. A computer might be happy to use the whole bandwidth in a very intensive short bursts, whereas we humans are more likely to let our expressions unfold in time with a much slower bit per second rate. What pertains to these kind of interface issues is part of the wider network ecology as well. In other words, for the network design problems, one was not able to assume that information flows steadily, despite, again, the kind of whole cultural imaginary around data as if it was on tap, flows in marketing discourses, etc., etc. This from London Tube, typical O2 advert. Information doesn't flow, it bursts. It happens only in bursts. And managing that bursting nature of signals and messages was a question of temporality in networks. What is introduced is a world of managing commodities and people in a manner that demands more responsiveness to the dynamics of the situation, as well as cooperation as an engineering dilemma. Interestingly enough, on a technical level, packet switching reinserted itself to a lineage of earlier pre-telephone-based communications. A media archaeology of package, which includes that of mail, the telegraph, and the nowadays less well-known torn paper switching systems, all of which allocate, I quote, bandwidth when a block of data is ready to be sent, and only enough for that one block to travel over one network link at a time. For sure, also delay can be seen as integral part of print-based media technological memory regimes. So it's kind of interesting question about delay and memory, obviously, referring to, Jack Goody's point. Delayed transfer is what we call tradition. It's only delayed transfer. With computers and networks, the regime of delay becomes automatized. in differing ways, incorporating memory and tradition as a network event, even of microtemporal duration. So these kind of typical humanities themes as, memory and duration and tradition, they become integrated as part of the technical network itself already. Various ideas concerning time management and implosion of distances is carried over to packet switching too. It becomes one way to encapsulate messaging into a public network space that is less an architectural space for humans, that is an assemblage of protocols for signal transmission. Such an arrangement is, however, more than a collection of software and hardware. These matters of signal processing takes a special position in terms of things public and things secrets. And quite aptly in relation to topics of NSA, the German media scholar Bernhard Siegert, his example is the introduction of pulse code modulation since the mid-20th century as a form of conversion of analog waves like speech into discrete signals. The telegraphics and subsequent digitalization of communication. The implication is that networks now share all things secret or mundane at the same time. Network ecology is this space, but also is this time that is constantly shared through every event, through simultaneous events of network communication. The origins of modern communication and information theory in cryptography becomes a generalized state of things, where in the words of Siegert, the most highly classified information of the NSA, National Security Agency, thus would be transmitted over the same network as the afternoon mystery series or the everyday blah 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 of people on the telephone. In other words, networks are ecologies of time, and our everyday blah 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 temporally mixed with the other sorts of cryptic messages, and obviously this couldn't be more apt because of the events or revelations of past couple of months of NSA actions. This exposes the engineering of time, which also includes an interest in how space is being shared and negotiated. Actually, these kind of quantified units are still negotiated in relation to speeds, times, slownesses, and synchronization. And I'm going to just wrap up with some points about microtemporality to make a kind of a general point instead of the slightly geeky details now, okay? Details about how do we read the network ecology through packets and understand that there are various temporalities within that ecology, and we have to be dealing with, have to introduce the fact that we can't talk about cultural theory of networks or hypertheory, whatever you want to call it, only through flows. We need to be much more accurate in relation to what kind of temporalities and cultural techniques of time there are. And synchronization is another key point that we already earlier heard about. So, okay, really briefly, microtemporality, what is it? So basically, this interest in microtemporality and what we could call time-critical events, not only time-based but time-critical events, emerges as one perspective to technical media culture. It doesn't only pertain to digital media, but in the way Friedrich Kittler, the German media scholar, suggested, technical media are anyway about the time axis manipulation. What is technical media? It's about time axis manipulation. Reverse, fast forward, bend, stretch, slower, quicker, and so forth. Stuff that you can do with time. Kittler's views were sound-oriented, but also inspiring towards a view of larger media technological philosophy of time. In the words of Sibylle Krämer, German media philosopher, and her explanation, which also remains a good way of critically engaging with some of the blind spots in Kittler's account, and I'll quote Sibylle Krämer. Technology provides a means of channeling this irreversibility. In media technology, time itself becomes one of several variables that can be manipulated. In the age of writing and the book, symbolic time, by being fixed in space with linear syntactical structures, becomes repeatable and to some extent also movable. What is unique about the technological era, from the gramophone to the computer, is that these technologies allow one to store real time. In other words, those processes that cannot be fixed by syntactical structures and are thus not irreversible, but rather contingent, chaotic, and singular, and at the same time to process real time as temporal event. Data processing becomes the process by which temporal order becomes movable and reversible in the very experience of space. But, you know, all these kind of meditations that we inherited from Kittler and that are more well known, I would actually point that Kittler is just one way of starting discussions about time and temporality in technical media. To me, the latest significant development of notions of technical time emerges with work of Wolfgang Ernst. His media archaeologically branded work is actually underpinned by a very specific temporal ontology, which he rolls out as a way to understand technical media, including networks. In short, for Ernst, media archaeology points to a different sort of a temporal ontology than that of historical narrative. Indeed, in a media-specific mode, Ernst introduces notions such as the Eigenzeit of machines. It's kind of that machines have their own temporality. They're not only in time and can't be placed only in time like media historical time, but actually technical media creates time. They work in specific temporalities and they create time. What does that mean? So the temporality is specific to technological frameworks, underlining that they do not only exist in historical time, which is susceptible to narratives and contextualization, they also create time. The time of network pings, hard drive revolutions, computer clock speeds, or for instance, the examples about delays and queues and managing network temporalities of packets. These are examples of times that are created in technological arrangements that are not really reducible the way in which we usually think about media historical time, right? There's something else going in here, something of a different temporal order. Indeed, this kind of perspective differs from a macro perspective in which things can be placed in time, but to underline how meticulous technologies of time create horizons as well, all of which are not cognitively, at least directly accessible to the human. Okay? Indeed, this kind of a ecology of time pitches the concept of time criticality as one sort of an anchor for our conceptual elaborations. For Ernst, it pertains especially to the technical media, which is seen as fulfilling the medium being only when they are in operation, making them, and I quote, especially microtemporal intrusions, irritation, making them susceptible especially to microtemporal intrusion, irritation, and manipulation. This regime is one of calculation instead of narrative. He offers a slight nod towards Heidegger, talking about medium being, right? But it's also a part of a wider context in which he's interested in counting as one form of telling, right? So it's a kind of a German play of words also with jumping from erzählen, narrative telling, to zahlen, numbers, counting, to put it in German. This means a new process-oriented media archaeological perspective that opens to the machine, understood broadly, and in our case through the network ecology of times. We're not dealing with disappearance of time or temporality, not with monotemporality, not with this kind of a sudden, universal time only, but a radical multiplication of minuscule, tiny time operations, cultural techniques of time mobilized through engineering perspectives. And in a way, this feels strongly familiar. We know so much already through different contexts, which take into account such events that are below the perception threshold and the contexts that range from neurosciences to economy, from software-based flash crashes to the way in which perception builds up. And you know the fantastic work, not least done here by Mark Hansen, Catherine Hales, but also other people like Shintaro Miyazaki's combination of scholarship and also artistic work that he calls algorithmics. Go Google that, fantastic work. So in short, for the network ecology contexts, also media archaeology of the time networks allows for at least two things as a brief summarization. Firstly, for media theory, it means the necessity to consider much richer notions of time, ones that point to cultural techniques of time, the idea of synchronization that comes out in projects, also in projects like Miharvis, where I started with, as a kind of short prelude to this talk, but secondly also for network politics, It points to these longer-term genealogies and histories in which speeds and slownesses of networks are embedded. Thank you.
It's been fun what I've been able to take in from today and from yesterday, UC's visit, and I apologize to those of you who gave talks and did things here before I was able to come. It sounded like it was a lot of fun and set off a lot of bursts, right, in people's brains and probably in networks that they're not even aware that they're engaged in. So that's very cool, and we should thank Amanda, who has run this thing very smoothly from the beginning and is just going to make her job more difficult as she moves forward, because we're all going to go to her to do this kind of stuff forever. So, yeah. So I want to be fairly brief because I'd like to leave time for questions from everybody for UC. And I'm going to try to ask a few questions of my own along the way. I think I have 3, but you never know when you start going. So I'm going to start out by saying one thing that's amazing about UC is that, at least as I see him, he's somebody who is attempting to introduce the work of the German tradition, German media science, which really was made famous by Kittler, who is the teacher of one of the theorists he mentioned, Bernhard Siegert, and who in a certain way is the inspiration for Wolfgang Ernst, who sees himself as carrying on the technical side of Kittler's work. And UC's been very interested in introducing this work into a larger public than simply the German public, where it's, this is what everybody does. And to also finding shortcomings in this tradition. For example, as he told us yesterday, their lack of any kind of political awareness or political interests. And so he's done a lot with trying to bring this work into some kinds of configurations with a lot of the work that's been done by neo-Marxists from Italy, but also from the US, who are interested in the time of labor and the time, free labor online and all these kinds of issues that involve machinic dimensions of time that have a directly political content, but that don't always attend specifically enough to the technical networks on which this takes place. And that's really what the role of this kind of stuff is for. So I don't see him I see him as somebody who's actually taking the work of these critics, and especially the paradigm of cultural techniques or cultural technologies that's grown out of Kittler's work, and really, to my understanding, is instantiated by Bernhard Siegert, right? Not by Wolfgang Ernst so much, but to take this and make it something that has a broader interest and a broader appeal than what is happening in German media circles. And so I don't align him with these people, but I think that he might have some baggage from that tradition that I find problematic. And so I want to try to bring that out if I can. So I want to say, first of all, before I start doing that I agree with UC on many points. For example, I agree with him that time is technical and artifactual, that there is no time without inscriptions of time, which, whether or not they're using advanced computation or any kind of direct technology that we know of or that we would call technical media, is nonetheless technical, right? It requires a measurement, right? And I consider, the various ranges of human experience, which are not simply time consciousness, but also sensibilities of all sorts, also forms of measurement, right? But I agree with him on that claim that time is technical and artifactual. I agree with him also that there are a multiplicity of times. I agree with him that time is not limited to or constituted by human experience and does not take place solely in human time frames, and especially against the Husserlian tradition phenomenology that time is not constituted by human consciousnesses, right? I mean, this is clearly not true, right? It took a long time Husserl realized it and couldn't quite get there, but it's clearly not true, right? I agree with him finally, and this isn't finally, it's just the end of the things I'm going to mention here, that time technologies operate in ways that may be cognitively inaccessible to humans. And in fact, that's a lot of what's interesting to me and my students and colleagues here who work together on these projects, right? To think about how it is that we're nonetheless impacted by these operations of time that we don't have any kind of cognitive or even perceptual access to at all, right? But as I said, I think I disagree, and I'm not sure because he may be more cagey than I think, and he may come up here and say, I'm saying what you're saying, but then that's cool. I like that. I think I disagree with him in the claim that, as I heard him saying, or at least as I heard his paper embodying, that time is constituted through cultural technologies. Okay? So it may be that you're not saying that, but if you are saying that, I think I disagree with that. And I think I disagree with that for a specific reason, and that is because, in my opinion, it overemphasizes the operations of cultural techniques created by humans but not for human experience, and in the process marginalizes the role of human experience, right? And the role of models of thinking about human experience, which I want to talk about in a minute. And so I'm going to try to explain that. Okay, so I've already said a whole bunch about cultural techniques. I don't need to say that. So my fear is that an overemphasis on cultural technologies of time presents a skewed picture where human time can only be operationalized to fit into technical network ecologies, right? And I hear him saying this, not directly, of course, but in a kind of echo effect. For example, in the part of his paper where he talks about Jack Goody, and he talks about delay, right? And he says, delay can be seen as an integral part of print-based media technology memory regimes, a point that Jack Goody makes. Jack Goody, the anthropologist, right, who works on writing. Delayed transfer is tradition, right? We inherit tradition because of the delay that writing allows, for example, right? That's what he's talking about. Then Jussi says, with computers and networks, the regime of delay becomes automatized in differing ways, incorporating memory tradition as a network event of microtemporal duration, right? And I read that as operating a kind of operationalization of human experience, right? So tradition, which we think of as something that happens at the framework of human memory, human time experience, and so on, gets turned into something that is automatized in networks where humans are simply excluded and human experience is not important and not in any clear way still involved. Although I hear you saying it's still involved, I think that there's a problem there. Right? So I want to suggest that a different way of thinking about time measurement and the technicity of time, and I explored this a little bit in a paper I've written a number of years ago. It was published in 2009 in Theory, Culture, and Society, called Living with Technical Time, which also actually looks at some artworks. So if we think of time measurement as equally, right, although not always in the same moment, technical and cultural, phenomenological, and cosmological natural, right, then in my opinion, both machine time and human time can be looked at as measurements of, in some certain sense, although very broad sense, the same cosmological, physical, natural time, right? A time that is neutral in relation to and also prior to or beneath the division that is, in my opinion, structuring Jussi's paper between machine and human, right? So I'm suggesting, to put it in a more simple way, that human neuronal processes, human consciousness, human sensibility are various forms of measurements of time that are in some ways exactly the same as microtemporal computational measurements of time, right? And they're all involved in a larger ecology of time that, in my opinion, cannot be theorized through the tradition of German media theory that runs to Bernhard Ziegert, called cultural technologies or cultural techniques, right? Where the emphasis is on the human creation of networks that leave human experience out, right? That cannot attend to the way that humans are also measuring time in similar kinds of ways, right? So in my own work, and I don't want to talk about my own work, but I've been interested in exploring the way that humans and machines have co-evolved, from forever, right, in very complex networks. And so I would like to, welcome the idea of thinking about time in terms of networks, and even networks that are necessarily machinic today, but I want to have an expanded picture of what that is, I think, in relation to what Jussi's saying. So I want to recur then to a different tradition, a broader tradition in a certain sense, and try to ask how the media archaeological tradition of cultural technologies of time interfaces with the philosophy of time. And I'm thinking in particular of the work of Paul Ricoeur, right, in his 3-volume magisterial study, Time and Narrative, where he presents an aporia between two fundamental modes that Western philosophy has thought about time, right? The physical mode, which dates back to Aristotle, who defines time as the number of movement according to the before and the after, right? So time is a minimal inscription of difference, right, of a before and an after that takes place in all physical processes, right? And then for Ricoeur, the second tradition is the phenomenological tradition, beginning for him with St. Augustine's Meditations on Time in the 11th Confession, and following through to the great phenomenological project of Husserl, which tries to think of time as, in Husserl's sense, strongly constituted by human consciousness, but in other ways, maybe more loosely we could say, as related to the flux of human duration, right? And the way Jussi puts it in his paper is the difference between bursts, maybe we could say, minimal inscriptions of before and after, and flows, right? Or larger temporal structures, at any rate, whatever we call them. So let's see. What time is it? It's always a relevant question. Oh, good. We're good. Okay. Couple of people that I became really interested in when I was doing my own research on time, who can be seen as, can be put into the post-Ricoeurian position. So Ricoeur finishes his great study with, these are aporetic, we can't resolve them, only narrative can suture the gap, blah, 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 blah. Okay, not something that I'm into. I mean, I don't find it convincing, okay? And it's also really long to read. Okay, so a couple of people that have carried it further are a philosopher and I guess he's a computer engineer who's turned cultural critic. The philosopher is a French guy named Dominique Janicot, who wrote a very great book called Chronos, only unfortunately available in French so far. And the engineer turned cultural critic or media critic is Adrian Mackenzie, right? And these guys give two differing, though complementary in my opinion, takes on how technics link machines and bodies, right? And machines and bodies not simply as aggregate gross modo things, but as, comprised of a multiplicity of times in each case, right? And inscriptions of time. So linkages that are multiple and constantly changing and so on, right? So technics link machines and bodies in ways that move beyond the classical phenomenological account of time that is human-centered and so on, right? But that nonetheless preserve the role of human experience in the larger ecology, cosmological ecology, let's call it, of time, inscription, or cultural inscription. I'm not sure I like the word cultural, but time inscription. And that in a certain sense resolve Ricoeur's impasse. Okay, so for Mackenzie, and this actually seems to resonate in a lot of ways with what Jussi just said, for Mackenzie, it's a regime of clock time as it's instanced today in the atomic clock, right? So ranging from 1 oscillation per second to 9 billion oscillations per second, right? And so I quote from Mackenzie's book, Transductions, which is a very interesting book. Clock time as it moves between 1 oscillation and 9 billion oscillations per second can be seen as a temporal and topological ordering that continues to unfold from a metastability. The way in which clock time incorporates new sources of variation and restructures itself in the process can be compared to the provisional resolution that a crystal represents for the metastable supersaturated solution, right? And he's obviously thinking about Simondon's work on individuation in natural systems crystals, right? That proceed from a metastability, right? So this idea of, here he's giving a focus on clock time, but not clock time as it's artifactualized in clock technologies the way that I think the cultural technics tradition would think about it, but as a kind of concept, right? The concept of this broad continuum of time that's certainly instantiated in the atomic clock, right? Which is also then a measurement of the atom splitting or whatever. I don't even know how that works, right? And that, is a continuum that encompasses, everything from, the smallest physical time thing to cosmological time, with humans somewhere in between, right? So Janicot gives a slightly different, and in a certain way, more radical, at least philosophically, reading of it, where he says the activity of measurement is what's really important. And measurement is something that clocks measure, humans measure, right? But clocks do not have a kind of monopoly over measurement, right? They are one form of measurement, and measurement is really what gives us the technification of time. There is time only as measured. Time is never pure. Measurement makes time appear, but this emergence cannot be restricted to our clock time. Clock time does not comprise, either empirically or conceptually, an absolutely homogeneous unity. It has a history, a relativity that is under constant control and is ceaselessly brought to a halt. The two senses of measure overlap. There is no strict divide between clock time and lived duration. There is purity neither on the side of duration nor on the side of the objectivity of leveled time, right? And what's really interesting about Janicot's study, for me especially because I have such an interest in phenomenology, is the way that he critiques everyone, and mostly Heidegger, for misunderstanding this fundamental fact about time, right? And that means, Heidegger denigrates clock technologies and so on. This is why these Germans are so into this, right? And Janicot says he totally misunderstood the fact that measurement stands beneath the clock, right? Just as it stands beneath human duration, right? And you can't privilege human Dasein as a time measuring system. You have to think about it on these two axes, right? So it's a brilliant study because it shows the incompleteness and the failure of phenomenology and its classical formations to actually deal with the problem it took as its own problem, right? As its own major problem, time. Okay, so that's enough with my quotations. Okay, so I guess the question that I want to ask to Jussi, I've now presented it as like a critique of Jussi and all that kind of stuff, which is what we do. But I mean, I have this as a real question because some of the stuff in his paper, I find it fascinating, but I also find that it's coming from a different place than where I come from, even though I feel like we have some similar feelings about the value of this tradition, for example, and about time. So I'm wondering if maybe we've just as a kind of generational shift, we've moved away from thinking in relation to media, certainly from thinking about time in relation to this philosophical tradition, right, that's presented by Ricoeur, right, but that's very rich and could include a lot more stuff about science and so on. If we've moved away from that kind of large-scale philosophical division between physical and lived time, objective time, durational time, as Janicot puts it, into a kind of new formation that's happy to embrace the operationalization of the human, right? Or to put it another way, the idea that human experience is simply an epiphenomenon of machine networking, right? And I know this is what Ziegert thinks because, we had a discussion about this and, he says in the end it's always some system that's been designed that's constructing this whole thing and that's allowing you to think it and so on and so forth, right? So I'm asking you, do you think is there something like that, a kind of generational shift, a different kind of way of thinking about time in relation to techniques that has happened today? So that's my first question, right? Is Ricoeur's aporia still valuable for us? Second question, and my next two questions are short, so I'll be done in a second. Second question involves the notion of bursts, right? And the relation of bursts, let's say, to that great concept of time experience, Bergson's notion of duration, right? But it could be, I don't know, unities of time in Husserl or whatever, right? Flows of time, and so on. And I perceive Jussi as aligning bursts with machines. And this happens in his paper when he says, a computer might be happy to, I like that, might be happy to use the whole bandwidth in very intensive short bursts. whereas we humans are more likely to let our expressions unfold in time with a slower bit rate, or bits rate, right? That's a different claim, I think, from the critique that's sort of subterranean here, which is a critique of the whole Castell's notion of flows and all that kind of stuff, right, which I also agree with. So here, I guess my question is, well, I'm thinking about things like, brain science, which, has, at least in some cases, has made the claim that thinking happens in these neuronal bursts, right? So, that what's going on behind, however, what happens in our brains relates to our experience, what's going on there is a burst-like structure that's then manifesting itself in something that seems continuous, right? Or another example is this study, which I read a while ago, and I was trying to remember what the claim was by this guy, Albert Laszlo Barabasi, who wrote Linked, right? But he wrote another book after that called Bursts, right? And his idea was that he's really interested in how the future can be predicted, not at the social level, but at the individual level, right? And he's looking at, all these technologies today and companies that analyze behavior and so on. So the idea there is that our behavior happens in bursts, right? Most of the time we're kind of not doing much, and then we have these bursts, right? And these things can create patterns that can be analyzed and can predict the future, right? So the question I want to ask is, this idea of bursts, which I think is really interesting, which you seem to apply to machine networks and so on. What if we generalized it to apply also to human, different modes of thinking about human experience that don't take integrated perceptual phenomenological experience as the basis, but neuronal processes or behavioral stuff that involves, like what we're trying to do in our S-1 stuff, where we isolate particular elements of behavior and treat them as autonomous inputs to a system, right? What if we were to do that, right? What could we say about the integration of humans and machines in these larger cosmological networks? Okay, and finally, my third point, or my third question, involves, it's a question that involves the relationship of Jussi's work here that you heard today to some of the other work that he's been doing, and I think maybe doing more of recently, which he mentioned at the very beginning of his talk, which I find extremely interesting also, which is studies of geological media, right? So chemical processes, all sorts of, quote-unquote natural processes that are happening in most cases at time frames that are the opposite of microtemporal, right? They're so large that they don't also resolve into human experience, and they create the resources that we build our media out of, right? But they also, I think you're arguing, form themselves media, right? So we need to expand our entire media understanding to this cosmological dimension of geological time processes. And so my question is, isn't there a conflict here? And this goes back to my original point about human experience being left out, why we need a larger cosmological ecology network of time. Isn't there a conflict between the emphasis in this talk on cultural technologies of time, which would be human, in some sense, human creations that leave human experience out, paradoxically, right, that are constitutive of time, and then the claims about geological media, where it's geological processes that give us the resources that in a certain sense are what time measures according to Aristotle's definition, right? That would be natural, although not natural in a sense that nature is opposed to cultural, but natural in a sense that it's beneath the divide of nature-culture, it's beneath the divide of machine-human, and so on, right? So I wonder, to me there's a tension, at least if not a conflict, between those two interests of yours, and I'd be really happy to hear you say a little bit more about how they relate. So, anyways, thank you very much, Jussi.
I think we're going to be here for a long time. No, that was brilliant. I really appreciate it. That was really good summary. Also, really good in a way you can show where variations where we can go with this kind of whole theme, which actually, as you just demonstrated, unfolds into really huge and really central questions of media theory as well, and philosophy of techniques actually. So even before you got to your questions, there was a huge amount of things that would have been possible to comment on, at least to continue, or at least have a kind of a discussion on which are really interesting. A lot of the kind of discussions around contemporary media theory, by definition and by force, they almost need to really simplify a lot of the positions that we are taking. For instance, one of the simplifications has to do with that, there's more American-style media phenomenological school of techniques like Mark's work, and then this German hardware-oriented one, which of course, as you kind of demonstrated, it's actually, again, one of those false binaries, false dichotomies, because there's a kind of a range of theories that are anyway working across these divisions. A good example is your stay at Weimar and possibilities of tapping into Bernhard Siegert's work, which is really a good way of, and your first question as well, as a kind of a different generation of thinking about techniques and time. And it really shows, in a way, the generations of theory, how they seem to tap into different kind of sources. Germans, for instance, have been really good in reading, especially Heidegger, but also in a way Husserl, but especially Heidegger, not through only as the kind of the peasant Heidegger, happy to wander without technology, and the anti-technological Heidegger, but actually reading through Heidegger's relation to cybernetics, and extrapolating from that a very different kind of a Heidegger that we often encounter in philosophy courses, a media theoretical Heidegger, and in a similar way looking at some of the other phenomenological thinkers through their implicit technological, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit technological times. What makes these people like Siegert really interesting is that they are actually pulling from different directions. And I think, for instance, they're kind of what's your home ground as well in relation to Simon Dohn's thinking and transduction, which brilliantly comes out in Mackenzie's work, is another kind of a theme which kind of coalesces a different school of thinking and actually works through some of the problems that could have been there, for instance, with Kittler. So I kind of agree on that, and I kind of the whole idea about that you brought forward with Mackenzie is absolutely brilliant. In a way, I really briefly hinted about the kind of symphony of times, which actually might solve some of the problems that you pointed out as well. Symphony of temporalities, as of me, kind of when I studied history, we talked about Fernand Braudel and his model of traditional historical times, as a historian, that is always includes various temporalities that are overlapping at the same time. The time of geography, the time of social, the time of the event, and hence his metaphor of the polyphonic temporalities. And in a way, there's something that actually fits in with the idea of transduction, Simondonian temporalities, which take in the clock time, but point being that synchronization works also in relation to human times as well, which brings a much richer notion of what we can do with time. And I think I'm closer actually to what you just said in relation to this scheme of let's take the specific methods of analysis from German theory, but we need to be aware of it, how it transduces in relation to the, let's say, affordances of human body as media itself. Right? Media in the sense of that it measures as well, that you kind of elaborate in much more finer terms as well. I'm going to be really brief. I'm going to, we should be talking so much more in more detail about your fantastic comments, but it's also getting late, so my brain is getting slower.
And he's not enough bursts yet either.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, exactly. Number two, the bursts theme.
Keep them on the defensive, right? When people are responding.
Exactly. But I've got actually, food and wine in the corner, so I can always start eating. The number 2 point is really interesting. It's interesting also from a kind of a, let's say, cultural discourse point of view. So I'm kind of evading the question in the sense that, in a similar way that emergence became such a key trendy concept, 1990s, 80s and 90s, in a way bursts through that fantastic example of Barabasi, for instance, is taking its place as well, partly picking up on similar discourses in complexity and especially emergence, that we got emergence from anything from traffic to brains to technologies, and now we're talking about it in relation to bursts. So it's a kind of a concept that actually, yes, allows us to transpose across scales, right? So it's a kind of a, there's a risk of it becoming too big of a concept, but I think it points towards the same things of relation to emergence as well as synchronization. There's something there that can be done critically with it as well, as you hinted out. So not to dismiss brains as being bursts. I completely agree as well. Something interesting that Wolfgang Ernst is doing around brains, and more neuroscience context, but I didn't tap into it because I don't know it too well. And then the number 3 is a really something I'm not sure I'm able to even answer, because it's a really difficult question in relation whether it's a contradiction as well. I think what we need to, thinking through the other thing that I'm interested in, the extremely long durations, the seemingly slow durations of planetary and cosmological durations that seem to have some kind of relation to us humans. You know, Manuel Delanda wrote a fantastic book of 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History, where he kind of pitched off, you know, especially, 1,000 years, past thousands of years in relation to the dynamics and nonlinear dynamics and structurations of human history through rocks and diseases, I think it was genes, and then language, also as a kind of a language as a non-human element. So we should actually push into even more radical theme of, you know, not only thousands, but actually thousands and millions of years of media history that is nonlinear as well, in relation to the mineralization processes that constitute the fact that we've got stuff like rare earth minerals, right? So there's this kind of an ontological point that the speculative realist would happily pick up on, when the Maya Seuss thinking about the ancestral and the non-human in that sense, as a kind of a ultimate, objection of or danger for any kind of human correlationist thought. But actually, what I'm more interested in than that, perhaps, is acknowledging this ontological point, but also that any kind of a knowledge about the non-human durations that are of geological durations or planetary durations, especially in climate debates, has to do with, of course, computer simulations, right? So the epistemology that we got about the Earth and the cosmology and these kind of spheres is in a way also mediated by the microtemporalities of computationality. So it's kind of already mixed bag, right? So anything that we say about that is really long-term about the Anthropocene has to do with specific scientific simulation techniques that have their edge in computation as well. So there's something really funny going on where they get mixed, but that's as because I can say this late. Hopefully, it comes. But these are all ways to actually, I kind of am of the opinion that we kind of too easily use the word political as a general brand, that we're lacking politics. Actually, I actually think that there's a lot of political in German media theory, and but we can't always just say that you need to account for politics. But in this case, I think the aspects of synchronization that relate to the different temporalities and how we're able to synchronize them in relation to human issues is one way of actually tapping into what we constitute as the politics, right? The future-oriented aspects of, for instance, how to react to climate change and climate crisis, all that Wendy Chun's been fantastically working on and so forth. So there's something there that we can actually tap into. Yeah? Thanks.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.